Well, thank you all for coming. There's two things that I wanted to bring up before I really get started. One is, if you get on YouTube and you do Gary Wolfram, Silicon Valley Conservatives, you'll see Jerry Mungai introducing me and then walking off with my notes. So you just watch the first 5 minutes of it. It's a little humorous. The second thing is, John Miller has spoken here before, and he's the head of our journalism program. But he and I have had for the last 2.5 years a contest to see who has the most Twitter followers. And I have been ahead of him for a number, for probably 15, 16 months, but then John snuck ahead of me. So we get free lunch once a week, whoever's got the most Twitter followers, and I'm pretty close. So if you're following John Miller, stop following him. And just follow me on Twitter. You never have to do anything more than just log in and follow me. But what I'd like to talk about tonight is how poorly the conservative or classical liberal or free market-oriented folks have done in explaining why capitalism is good for the poor. If you look back to 1927, Ludwig von Mises wrote a little book called Liberalism in the Classical Tradition. And what he was talking about was liberal thought used to be thought of as limited government and free market allocation of resources. And he was complaining how liberalism had been stolen in a sense, but he still called it liberal thought. And he said that anti-liberal thought, on page 3 of the book, he says anti-liberal thought is going to cause, first, the Great Depression, second, World War II, third, that the Nazis are going to start World War II, and fourth, that they're not going to win, because they're not going to win the battle of ideas. And of course, all those things happen, and it's very interesting because he's writing this in 1927, when Irving Fisher, for example, one of the top economists in the world at the time, lost all sorts of money in the stock market saying it was going to go on forever. And so what is causing this is a change in political philosophy, what is going to cause all these problems. And also, he says that the only system that can create wealth for the masses is liberalism, is market capitalism. Market capitalism is, why am I writing this book? I'm writing this book because I want to help the poor, basically. I want to stop all these things that are going to happen, but my concern is with the poor. And we do a very poor job at explaining why market capitalism is the best system for the poor. And I think if we can do better at that, then we can also win the political arena. We can win in the political arena. Because who's going to not vote for you, even if you're running for state rep or you're running for Congress, who's not going to vote for you because you're helping the poor, right? If you're concerned with the poor, people are going to be attracted to your argument. And so I think that's what our focus ought to be. So I want to talk a little bit tonight about what market capitalism is and why it should be obvious that it is the only system that creates wealth for the poor. And everything else, this debate over inequality is really what Mises called the politics of envy. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But we shouldn't be concerned about how rich are the rich. If someone talks to you about inequality, you should be saying, we should be concerned about how rich are the poor, not how rich are the rich. That's who we should be concerned about. So what is market capitalism? Well, it's a system that has, based on private property rights. Mises said that private property is the key to civilization. You can't have voluntary exchange, you can't have social cooperation without property rights. No one in here is wearing entirely what they created themselves. No one in here only ate in the last week things that they either grew or killed themselves. No one in here actually constructed their home or their apartment or whether from scratch and just did it themselves. Okay? Food, clothing, shelter. We don't produce any of it. Somebody else does. And how can that possibly work? Because we produce something, we then have property rights over what we gain from that, usually a medium of exchange like money. And then we have property rights to whatever we're selling for the money. And then you take that money and you buy something from someone else. And they have property rights to that. So a system of markets requires that people have private property rights. And that is a key then to why you want to have individual liberty and limited government, is because property rights are such a crucial aspect to market capitalism. Second thing is it's based on voluntary exchange. Really, you think about that. How many have ever been to Walmart? Okay? Now, in Hillsdale, here's how it works. You don't go into the Walmart and they start throwing stuff into your cart and make you pay for it as you go out the door. Okay? Nor do you get to throw stuff in the cart and then stop at the counter and say, I'm giving you $5 for the lot, right? Mr. Walmart tells you if you want that box of cornflakes, it's $2.98, okay? And if you don't want to pay the $2.98, don't buy it. Everything is a voluntary exchange. And in Hillsdale, we do not have vans that drive around capturing people, taking them to the Walmart and chaining them behind the checkout counter. Anybody that's standing behind the checkout counter is there because they're willing to trade their labor for whatever Mr. Walmart is paying them. So if you really think about it, everybody that walks out of a Walmart is happier than when they went in. That's why the smiley face is their symbol. Now, a third thing is it's about limited government. Mises says that classical liberals are not anarchists. Life is, as Hobbes said, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short when you don't have a government. Why do you need government? Government is there to protect the property rights. It is very difficult for the private sector to do all property rights protection. I am relying on the city of Hillsdale to protect my house while I'm out here talking to you folks. And that makes sense, that government is there to protect property rights. That's why we form it in the first place. If you ever saw, there's a great philosophical movie about why we formed government, and it's called Ants. Has anybody saw the movie Ants? Okay. Well, Woody Allen character, he goes, he's the ant that leaves the anthill. And there's this whole philosophical discussion about that. Did the ants belong to, are the ants there for the anthill, or is the anthill there for the ants? Okay? And why do we have government? We are not here for government. We formed government to protect our property rights. That's why we have it. That's what John Locke said and Thomas Hobbes and everything. So now once you have limited government, the last part of this is you need rule of law. Why do you need rule of law? Because what Hayek talks about, Friedrich Hayek talks about the difference between rule of law and rule of man. The rule of man is what you had in the feudal system, where the Lord could decide, this is what the law is going to be today, and the Lord can decide if they're going to change it tomorrow. And if you're in the feudal period, that doesn't bother you too much. But if you're going to build a $50 million factory, you're going to want to know what the rules of the game are over the next 10, 15 years anyway. Because you're building this factory, and let's say you build a factory to make peanuts, and or to make peanut butter. I'll make peanut butter. So to make peanut butter, and then what will happen is 3 years into it, the government outlaws peanut butter. That's a problem. If you know that's what's going to happen, if you know that the rules can be changed at any moment, then you're not going to invest in things. You're not going to have a growth in the economy. I mean, imagine if you had a president that said, you know what, if the Congress doesn't pass this, I have a pen and I'm just going to write it. Then you would have rule of man rather than rule of law, and market system wouldn't work very well. Now, let's just talk about some key characteristics of market capitalism. So, as I talked about before, it's a system of voluntary exchange. Now, what does that mean? It means that anytime you see an exchange in a market economy, both parties got better off. It's unanimous. Whenever you swap, and Adam Smith talked about this in an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. Right? It wasn't just called Wealth of Nations. It's an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. He's talking about why it is that they're so wealthy. He says, why is it the poorest Scotsman is wealthier than the greatest African tribal chief? And he says it's because the way the system works, the way we're organizing ourselves. He's seeing the beginning of market capitalism. And what he says, he points out that how does it work? I give you this which you want, and you give me that which I want. That's how it works. It's a voluntary exchange. So anything that happens in a market system, both parties got better off. And that means that how do I get wealthy in a market system? There's only one way to get wealthy in the market system, and that's please other people. I can't force you I can't force you to buy my labor, right? You know what we really need is one of those things where you have the big face, the person's face, and you hold it up and down like, you know, that basketball coaches get that, right? Maybe economist speakers should get that. But you have to please other people in order to get them to give you their money. And so I can't force you to buy my labor. I can't force you to buy my product. I can't force you to buy anything. So if I'm going to become wealthy and get millions of people to give me millions of dollars, there's only one way. I got to figure out a way to please lots and lots of people. That's the only way it works. In the Bible, what does it say? It says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And in a market system, that's not good enough. You got to do unto others things they don't even know they want done unto them yet. I didn't know I was going to need an iPhone 8 or whatever for my wife, okay? But there's people out there willing to take on the incentives to innovate. Innovation is why you're wealthy. Okay? You're not wealthier than the King of England in 1263 because you have more tapestries than he did. You just have lots of stuff that he never had. In fact, you have more things. I guarantee you, each one in this room has more things than John D. Rockefeller did, who was the richest man in the world 100 years ago. And so why is that the case? Just do this experiment. Over the next week, observe all the things that you will use that did not exist in 1950. And you will, like, how many in here know what a wind wing is? Okay, well, some of you may not remember, but the way it worked was air conditioning in a car meant roll the windows down, okay? And so you get all the stuff blowing in. So there used to be these little triangles at the start, and you could just open that and have the wind go in towards your face, right? Kids today, they're not going to see a wind wing, right? They expect air conditioning. They expect to go 72.5 degrees. So why does that happen? Because to innovate requires you do something different. If we already don't know how to do it, it's not innovation. But innovation then requires risk. Steve Jobs did not know that if he spent millions, dropped out of college, spent millions of dollars making an iPhone, that somehow you guys were going to want to pay enough for that iPhone that it would pay for the resources that went into producing it. He took on that risk. And he might have got it wrong. Lots of people get it wrong. How many in here have pet rocks? Okay? So why is it then that we have so much innovation here? We have so much innovation because we have an incentive to innovate in a market system. What we do is we have profit, right? And that's what profit is about. Profit is about taking on innovation, and that is the reward for making it so that the poorest among us have cell phones. So now let's think a little bit about what if I'm trying to do is I say I want to set up a economic system that makes it the most efficient system so that consumers decide what's going to be produced. Now, some people might not want to do that, right? They might say, gee, we're supposed to send somebody off to benevolent dictator school and they're supposed to come back and tell us what they want, right? Maybe tell you, here's what kind of health care you ought to have, right? There might be somebody that would do that. But let's pretend that, we want consumers to decide. Well, then what's the most efficient way to do that? Just logically think about how market capitalism works as I've just described it. We said it's a system of voluntary exchange. But what does that mean? It means that I have to pay every owner of a resource, whether it's your labor, whether it's electricity, whether it's steel, whether it's plastic, I got to pay them the value in the next best alternative. Because if I've got you working for me for $8 an hour, then you couldn't have been making $9 an hour somewhere else, or you'd be somewhere else. I can't pay you $100 for a ton of steel if you could get $110 for it, because it would be somewhere else. So if I've got that ton of steel for $110, then I know that that's the best it could have done somewhere else. Okay? So now what I got to do? I have to make something that that consumers value more, or I go out of business. If I paid $100 for resources, I can't make something that consumers only want to pay $90 for. Anybody who's been in business, you know that, right? You don't get to lose money in every unit and make it up in volume. It just doesn't work that way. So that tells you that anybody that's in business over any length of time is making a better use of resources from what consumers' point of view is than any other way of doing it. If you're earning what's called economic profit, if you're earning profit, what is that? That's a signal that says, I'm making more, I'm making something that consumers value more than what these resources could have done anywhere else. That is just the pure logic of it, and how can there be another system that's not the best, that is more efficient than that? It can't be more efficient than that. In order to get the resources, I have to pay them their value and their next best alternative. Then I got to make something that consumers value more, or I go away. And so that means that market capitalism has to be the best way of using resources to please consumers. And again, maybe we decide that consumers don't know how to choose things, and we should impose upon them and tell them what kind of cars they should drive, or what kind of whether they should have trans fats in their foods or something. But that's not market capitalism. Okay, that is the benevolent dictator. And there might be people that want to go to back to Plato's Republic, but even Dr. Arndt, I don't think, would like to do that. So why should the poor benefit? Well, there's a lot of incentives to make things for the poor. If you want to get rich, you're not going to get rich by making stuff for the rich. There's not enough of them. If you're going to get rich, you're going to get rich making things that the poor can afford to have. The guy that started Intel said that he'll get super wealthy when everyone can own a laptop computer, right? He knows that because then he's going to be selling lots and lots of chips, okay? So there's a very big incentive to create things for the masses. Cell phones, for example. How many poor people have cell phones? Probably almost all of them, right? And not just in the United States, but around the world. Poor people around the world have cell phones. Why is that? I mean, somebody's going to get extremely wealthy if what they do is they develop a little solar heater that you can use to heat your house in sub-Saharan Africa and not have to, start a fire in your house to keep warm. Whoever's going to invent that and can make it cheap enough that everybody in sub-Saharan Africa can afford it is going to get wealthy. That's how you get wealthy. You get wealthy by pleasing other people, and you get very wealthy by making it so that the poor can buy what you have. Another thing is, I have an incentive to make the poor productive. If you're a laborer and you're poor, what does that tell you? It tells you your opportunity cost is low. It tells you that you couldn't get more doing something else. That's why you're making $4 an hour. Now, what I can do, though, is I can add what economists call capital. That is machinery, factory, computers, etc. And what does that do? It makes them more productive. Some of you are old enough to remember John Henry, you know, the steel driving man. What happens? He gets outcompeted by the steam shovel, right? So if you are building a canal and you're using a shovel, you're not going to be nearly as productive as if you're using a backhoe. So I have an incentive to move capital to where the low-wage labor is. Now, some of you may remember when made in Japan meant cheap, shoddy stuff made by cheap labor. Okay? That was the case when I was a kid growing up. Today, made in Japan means Lexus. And labor costs in Japan are higher than they are in the United States. Why is that? Because capital moved to Japan. Machinery, factories, technology, all that moved to Japan, and the labor got more productive. And what are you seeing in China right now? Exactly the same thing happening in China right now. If capital can move to where the low-wage labor is, if it can cross borders, what's going to happen? The poor are going to get wealthier. We also have an incentive to add education. That's what college is about. That's what high school, kindergarten, whatever is about. Well, you're going to be more productive as you gain more education. It's what economists call human capital. Working for a plumber as an apprentice adds to your human capital. It makes it so that you can learn job skills and you can learn how to do stuff. And as you get more productive, then you can get paid. What is outsourcing about? People talk about outsourcing. Outsourcing is really capital moving. People say the jobs are outsourced. Jobs are not outsourced. I have been to the Port of Long Beach, and I've never once seen a crate that had jobs on it and being loaded onto ships. Okay? That's not what happens. What happens is capital moves. Capital is going to move to where the low-wage labor is. And as it does, they're going to get more productive. And as they get more productive, there's going to be more stuff for everybody. So in a market capitalist system, when you allow labor and capital to move about, it will move to where it aids labor and labor can be more productive. So what about other systems of doing this? Central planning, for example. Socialism. We had a guy running for president a while back, Bernie something. The Sandinistas were involved, I think. What was he talking about? Socialism, central planning. Well, maybe that could work. Now, Mises in the book Liberalism, he says that socialists want to accomplish the same thing that capitalists do. Socialists want to create wealth for the poor, but their system can't do it. That's the problem. Now, Bastiat in 1850 wrote a book called The Law, where he argued that socialists wanted the world to be shaped in their whatever image they had, and if we just can all run around and act according to our own plan, it's not going to turn out that way. But Mises isn't saying that's why people are socialists. He's saying, look, they want people to be wealthy, and the problem is just can't happen. Why is that? Well, you got two big problems. One is the incentive problem. How do you get people to work hard? Now, what does Adam Smith say? He says, we don't rely upon the benevolence of the butcher or the baker for our dinner, but rather on their self-interest. Now, he doesn't say you'll never find the benevolent butcher. You'll have some people going to work hard whether they get rewarded or not. If you look at public schools, for example, you'll find great public schools. You'll find great superintendents. I was on the State Board of Education in Michigan for 6 years. You'll find great teachers. But systematically, it's a problem. Systematically, why? Because how do you get people to work hard when they're all being rewarded at the same rate? You'll have some people that will, but it's systematic, it's hard to do. How do we solve, and then how do people take on risk? Again, how do you get people to innovate? If you've seen the movie Beauty and the Beast, the animated version, which you should all watch, Beauty's father is a tinker. You know, some of you have seen that movie, right? He makes a wood chopping thing, and he's taken it off to some, I don't know, some place in the city where they're going to judge, you know, the inventions or something. But you know, he's a tinker. He's going to make the wood chopping machine whether he gets rewarded or not. And it's clearly not market capitalist system. They got beasts and castles and all sorts of stuff going on, right? So it's not that he's going to, so they're going to have the equivalent of Beauty's father, but systematic innovation, not going to happen without people being rewarded for taking on that incentive to innovate. But the bigger thing is what Mises and Hayek call the information problem. And that is that information is decentralized. That is, only you know how many hot dogs you're going to want, or how much toilet paper you're going to want, or how many peanuts you're going to want, or whether you want squeezably soft toilet paper or whether you want the single ply. Only you know that. And there's no way for a central planner to know that. Think about this. 9 million people woke up today in New York City and there was exactly the right amount of Starbucks coffee. And there was exactly the right amount of peanuts and toilet paper and bagels. And the same thing happened in Hillsdale, and I'm guarantee you that the same thing happened in the Bay Area, every city in the Bay Area. And it happened yesterday, and it's going to happen tomorrow. Every day we should just wake up and just be totally amazed. We should wake up and say, oh my gosh, this is incredible. Every retail outlet in America has the right amount of everything. How can that possibly be? In fact, when you're discussing with people about markets and they want to tell you, you know, if you were to talk to Bernie Sanders, just ask him that. Say, Bernie, how is it that, you know, 4.5 million people woke up in LA today and there's exactly the right amount of all the stuff? How does that happen? Well, we know how it happens. Prices. If there's too much Starbucks coffee in New York, what's going to happen? The price is going to go down. And when the price goes down, you guys are going to buy more. And producers are going to produce less. And if there's too little Starbucks coffee, what's going to happen? The price is going to go up. And when the price goes up, you guys are going to buy less of it, and the producers are going to make more. It's the price system. We don't need a minister I don't know, consumer goods, a secretary of consumer goods to tell us, oh, excuse me, you guys need to be making more Starbucks coffee here. Even if you thought about it, how in the world could you decide how much is going to be out there at every retail outlet in America, but not only that, but every moment in time? How could that possibly be? How could a central planner possibly know that? If we just observe. But that's part of what we don't do. In the first Sherlock Holmes tale, Scandal in Bohemia, there's a scene where, right at the beginning, where Watson's walking along and he sees Sherlock up in the apartment. And he walks up, knocks on the door, and Sherlock invites Watson in. They're talking for a while. And then he says to Watson, Watson, how many steps are there coming up from the ground floor? And Watson says, geez, I don't know. And Sherlock says, Watson, how many times have you walked up and down these steps? Hundreds. There are 17 steps coming up to the ground floor. The problem with you, Watson, is you see but you don't observe. And that's what we need to do. We need to observe that. Guess where there isn't the right amount of toilet paper? That would be Venezuela. There's not the right amount of anything in Venezuela. And why is that? Because they have a centrally planned state. It should be obvious. If we just observe, we could ask people that. How is it that there's exactly the right amount of all these products everywhere at every moment in time in market capitalism, and there's always a shortage whenever the government tries to set the price? If you want to have a shortage of gasoline when there is a natural disaster, make sure that you have price gouging laws. which doesn't allow the price to rise as demand is rising or as the supply is shrinking. In fact, just think about this. See this thing right here? Okay. This is talking about innovation. This thing is 5 generations old. Nonetheless, I could take a video of you guys and I could email it to somebody in London. And now you're going to tell me I can't teach a 4th grader to read in the city of Detroit? Or Los Angeles? Or Baltimore? Right? It's not a Detroit problem. It's not a Detroit public school problem. It's a systematic problem. When was the last time you heard somebody, gee, I want to move to Trenton to send my kids to the Trenton public schools? Okay? They don't even know what Trenton public schools look like. But your assumption's going to be those aren't very good. And why is that? Because as Milton Friedman pointed out some 50 years ago, the way we produce public education is the same way the Soviets produced agriculture. We don't produce it through a market system. If you really want to improve the education of people in America, particularly who? The poor. Particularly the poor, who's going to gain from choice in schools? Who's going to gain from making education the way that we do cell phones? It's going to be the poor that are going to benefit. You know, the richest among us, we can buy private education or we can move to where they have the benevolent butcher in the schools, but we can't do that if we're a single mom with 3 kids living in the city of Los Angeles, right? You can't do that. So what we need to do is to make the statement and make the point that this is beneficial for the poor. Now, there's a really good, brand new, it's within 2 months, the Brookings Institution's got a website, it's called the World Poverty Clock, and it is addressing what's been happening to world poverty. And by poverty, it's $1.90 per day in what's called purchasing power parity, but basically the equivalent of $1.90 per day. And today, there is about 635 million people out there living on less than $1.90 a day. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people that we could be helping. And how do you help them? You help them by moving into this market capitalist system. Sub-Saharan Africa, about 40% of all people in Sub-Saharan Africa live on less than $1.90 a day. And that number has actually increased in numeric terms. It's not in percentage terms, but in numeric terms, it has been increasing since 1990. Almost half of all children in Sub-Saharan Africa live in extreme poverty, less than $1.90 a day. Life expectancy in Sub-Saharan Africa is 59. There may be many of us in this room that are beyond the life expectancy that you would have had if you had been born in Sub-Saharan Africa. In the U.S., it's about almost 79. Now, what does it mean to be poor in America? Robert Rector at the Heritage Foundation has done at least 2 studies where he surveyed people that are families that meet the federal definition of poverty. And what does he find? 40% of all poor households in the United States own their own home. And on average, this is a 3-bedroom home. The average poor household in the United States has more than 2 rooms per person. They have more living space than the average person in Paris, London, Vienna, or Athens. The 89% have a microwave oven. 80% have air conditioning. Now, I grew up in Fresno, okay? And when I grew up in Fresno, the only place that had air conditioning, we called it refrigeration in those days, was the grocery store. What you had was you cut a hole in your roof and you put a pan of water there and you put a fan and you blew hot, humid air through the house and pretended it was getting cooler. That's what we had. Today, 80% of all poor households in America have real air conditioning. Now, what's happened in the rest of the world when it starts to move to market capitalism? Let's take a look at China. 1978, China began moving towards what they called special economic zones. And in the southern western or southern eastern part of China, they had these special zones where they started to move towards market capitalism. Basically, they said, Mao's Little Red Book is great, but we'd rather have flat screen television. So what happens? In 1981, there were 835 million people in China that were living on less than $1.90 a day. It was 88% of the population. Today, less than 2% of the population live in extreme poverty, and 20.2 million live in poverty. So that means more than 800 million people moved out of poverty in China since 1980. That didn't happen because all of a sudden they got smarter. It didn't happen because all of a sudden they were working harder. In fact, they were probably working harder under Mao than they were under market capitalism. Only one thing happened. They started to change the system by which they operated. You know, my students, I have a little video that I play for them of refugees and the late great Tom Petty song, Refugee. And the song says you don't have to live like a refugee. And he's right. If you live in an economic system of market capitalism, you don't have to live like a refugee. But if you live in a system that's based on central planning, then you are going to live like a refugee. China's growth rate is about 7.7% right now. We're happy if we get to 3%. Now, granted, they're growing off a smaller base, but still, China is growing quite rapidly. Now, if you look at India, India started out with not moving to the markets until the 1990s. They had in 1993 about 432 million people living in extreme poverty, which was 46% of their population. Today, both those things have been cut in half. They've cut the number of people and the percentage of their population living in poverty in half since 1993. Again, why did that happen? Their per capita income rose from $300 in 1991 to $1,709. It increased by more than 5 times in a very short period of time. Why is that? Because they changed the way that they organize themselves, not because they were working any harder. Think about historically. During 1,000 years of monarchy, so we had, when we had kings and queens and we had the feudal period. So during that 1,000 years, mankind's average income rose about 50%. Since 1820, when market capitalism is really in fruition in the West, it's risen by more than 1,000%. So you go 1,000 years and you're growing at 50%, and you grow 200 years, you grow by 1,000%. In the last 100 years, we've created more wealth, increased life expectancy more, and reduced poverty more than in the prior 100,000 years. And why is that? Because market capitalism is moving throughout the world. In the year 1000, the average life expectancy was 24. And by 1820, it was 36 in the West. Now, how many have ever seen, there's a really nice documentary about the Middle Ages. It's called Monty Python's Holy Grail. How many have seen that one? Okay? Well, there's a scene in it where King Arthur goes, "Old woman," and he turns around and he says, "My name is David, and I'm not old." Well, he is old because he's in his 30s. And in a feudal period, you are old if you're in your 30s. Why? Because the way you organized yourself, the way the social market worked, it was very different. It was not market capitalism. It was feudalism, which didn't have any of the incentives to innovate. It didn't have any of the incentives to work hard. By 2015, life expectancy in the United States was 79, and worldwide it's 70. And in fact, in Monaco, it was almost 90. So let's take a quick look at cross-sectional evidence. I mean, history ought to be, you can just ask somebody, if they're really big on central planning, say, hey, would you rather be King of England in 1263, or would you rather be yourself? And in Michigan, in February, indoor plumbing. It's going to be big. Now, the Fraser Institute has a very good book. It's called the Economic Freedom Index, and they list countries from the most economically free to the least economically free. And there's a number of things that they use in the index, but basically it's how much do you look like the market capitalism I've been talking about? Voluntary exchange, private property rights, limited government. And I'm going to just read quickly the countries that are in the top 10. They are Hong Kong's #1, Singapore, New Zealand, Switzerland, Ireland, the UK, Georgia, Australia. The United States is no longer in the top 10, unfortunately. It used to be 4th, but it's been moving, as Hayek said, on the road to serfdom. So keep those in your head. Now the bottom, and they don't include Cuba or North Korea, because they don't have data for that. But the bottom, from the bottom, it's Venezuela, Central African Republic, Republic of Congo, Algeria, Argentina, Libya, Syria, Myanmar, Chad, Iran. Now, all you got to do is ask somebody, say, look, I'm God, and I'm going to put you in any, you're going to be born, I'm going to put you in any country you want in the world. But you're going to be the poorest person there. No one's going to say, oh, Chad, Libya, right? North Korea, I want to be the poorest person in North Korea. No, it should be obvious. You want to be in a market capitalist system. As Arthur Laffer says, this is not rocket surgery here. This should be obvious. This is just a matter of observing. Anybody that tries to tell you that socialism is good for the poor, just ask them that question. Let's look at the countries that are most socialist and see if that's where you want to live and be poor. You're not going to want to live there. You're going to want to live in a market capitalist system. And if you just look at the raw numbers, if you look at the countries that are in the top 25% of economic freedom and compare them to those that are in the bottom 25% of economic freedom. The income per capita, if you're in the top 25%, is $42,463. If you're in the bottom 25%, it's $6,036. $42,000 to $6,000 income per capita based on, are you looking like market capitalism or are you looking like central planning? And not only that, but the countries that are more economically free are growing faster. The economic growth was 3.35% last year, and those that are the most free, and 1.66% for those that are the least free. And we would expect that. Because you're not in a market system, you're not going to be very effective in producing goods and services. If you look at poverty rates, that is what we call extreme poverty. I was just talking about $1.90 per day. The 30.3% of those 30.3% of the population in the countries in the bottom 25% of economic freedom live in extreme poverty. About 1 in every 3 people. In those countries that are in the top 25%, less than 1%. That should be obvious then that market capitalism is where you want to be if you're going to be poor. And then the Fraser Institute looks explicitly at the poor, and it has a table looking at those that are in the bottom 10% of the income distribution. If you look at the bottom 10% of the income distribution, the income per capita in those that are most free is $11,998, about $12,000. If you look at those in the least free, $1,124. You are 11 to 12 times wealthier. If you're poor, you're 11 to 12 times wealthier if you live in a country that's in the top 25% of economic freedom than you are if you're in the bottom 25%. Life expectancy. If you're in the bottom 25%, the life expectancy is 64.4 years. If you are in the top 25%, it's 80.7. The life expectancy is 16 years longer if you live in a country that's in the top 25% of economic freedom. Exactly what we saw historically. As we moved from system of feudalism to market capitalism, what happened? We had greater wealth, we have greater wealth for the poor, and we have greater life expectancy. Civil liberties, it is true that what Mises points out is he says you can't have political liberty without economic liberty. That's for sure. If the government owns all the land, how can you have the right to peaceable assembly? If the government owns all the media, how can you have the right to free speech? Some of you are old enough to remember Pravda. It's like I always had trouble. The devil loves Pravda. I mean, that's what I kept hearing. So any centrally planned state, what happens? The government controls the media. And why does the government control the media? Because they don't want you to realize what's going on in market economies. That was what the Iron Curtain was about. The Iron Curtain was there to make sure that you didn't know, if you lived in the Soviet Union, that you didn't know what was going on in the Western Europe. And when does the Berlin Wall fall? The Berlin Wall was not there to keep the West Germans from going into East Germany. That should be another point. We don't have to worry about South Koreans fleeing into North Korea. That should be an obvious point. So you can't have political liberty. How can you have the right to bear arms if you don't have private property rights? How can you have the right to free speech, the right to peaceable assembly? Murray Rothbard sort of pointed out that all the things that we think of as political liberties are really economic liberties. Now you can have the reverse. You can, as Hong Kong and Singapore point out, is that you can have economic liberty without political liberty. Ooh, I'm losing my... Oh, this is what happens when Eric Clapton's there and his guitar gets out of tune, right? The guy comes out and tunes it for him. Thank you very much. So, but the point is that you can have political liberty. You can have economic liberty without political liberty, but it is very uncommon because once you've got economic liberty, you tend to start to demand political liberty, and that's one of the transitions that's bothering people in China. How are they going to make that? How are they going to make that transition? But to summarize here, the question is, how do we get those 635 million people out of poverty? Those are the people we should be worried about. We should be worried about, again, not inequality. In fact, you need inequality for market capitalism to work, because I'm going to get rewarded for how well I please other people. And guess what's going to happen? What's going to happen is when China opens up, and now I can make 1.3 billion people happier than I ever could. And when India opens up to a market economy and I can please 1.2 billion people in India that I couldn't please, guess what? You're going to get really, really, really rich. How many have ever used a Microsoft product? Okay? How many here have ever paid to listen to me speak? See, that's why Bill Gates is rich and I'm not. You know? And so what's going to happen? Why is Zuckerberg going to get so wealthy? Because he can sell Facebook to billions of people around the world. That was not possible in 1978. So yes, the rich are going to get really, really rich. But worrying about how rich the rich are is the politics of envy. We need to worry about how rich are the poor. That's what we need to be worried about. And we know that the way that the poor become wealthy is only through market capitalism, through a system of voluntary exchange, private property rights, rule of law, and limited government. That's how you're going to get those 635 million people out of poverty. And how is that going to happen? That's going to only happen by winning the battle of ideas. That's what Mises was writing about in 1927 in his book. Anti-liberal thought is what's going to cause all these things that I'm talking about. World War II, the Great Depression, all that's going to happen. And the only way to stop it is to win that battle of ideas. And that's why you guys are here. You guys are here to win the battle of ideas. You know, the Liberty folks and Hillsdale College, what are we engaged in? We're engaged in the battle of ideas. And we can win that battle. It's not like it's unwinnable. All it needs is that we start to learn how to craft the argument and to point out the obvious, get people to observe. And I think that we have a great chance here to do that, because we have lots of opportunities that you didn't have in 1950. You've got Facebook, you have all sorts of social media, you have more television stations, you have all sorts of radio stations, you have you know, all sorts of mechanisms to get your voice heard, to just write a letter to your local paper. You know, I was a congressional chief of staff, and if we got a letter, if we started getting all sorts of letters in our local paper, the Hillsdale Daily News or Adrian Daily Telegram, we started paying attention. So you don't have to write something for the LA Times or the Oakland Tribune. You write something for your local newspaper, and you can make a difference. And you talk to 5 people, and they talk to 5 people, and they talk to 5 people, and pretty soon you'll start to really make a difference. And so I really want to thank you folks for coming tonight. I think we have time for a few questions, but thank you very much for having me.
I've got one to get us going. First, thank you so much. That was a great presentation. And I was sitting listening to you, and everything you said made sense, totally resonated, and I'm sure that's the same of most of the people in the audience. And yet, in the lay press or even in the political press, what we hear is that, especially millennials, and I guess you teach just below that grade right now, or maybe you're part of them, is, if this is true, that many of them don't believe in capitalism. They think it's bad, it's under 50%, they think it's a good idea. I realize this could be a long-winded answer, but maybe 3 reasons of what happened. How was that possible when everything you said makes so much sense?
Well, one reason that it happens is because that they're not being taught in public schools that market capitalism is the system that created all this wealth. They see, but they don't observe. That is the real key. I try to drill that into my students. See and observe. That's why you get all sorts of public policy problems, is not getting people to observe. And there's very little of observation out there. There's very little learning about how the market system works, or even seeing how the market system works. Just quickly, that I was at University of Michigan campus, Ann Arbor, and there was a guy running for vice president. His name was Tim Kaine. And he came out, and there was probably 3,000 students there. And he came out and he said, I want to make it against the law. I'm running for vice president. Then I want to make it against the law for anyone who could not produce $15 an hour worth of product to get a job in America. I want to make sure that if you can't make $30,000 of product per year, you cannot work in America. That's my America. And everybody clapped. Now, what he really said was exactly the same thing, only he said it as, I'm for a $15 an hour minimum wage. It was saying the exact same thing, but people viewed it differently. So it is a matter, I think, for what we need to do is to educate people, but you got to get them with their emotion. Talk about that single mom with 3 kids in the city of Detroit or in the city of East Los Angeles. Make that the starting point. And I think once you do that and start to explain that, you know, I was talking to somebody earlier. My kid's going to do fine with a $15 an hour minimum wage. Why is that? Because where is he going to get his job experience? He's going to work for zero. And what do we call that? Yeah, internships. Okay? Poor people aren't going to get internships. Their kids aren't getting internships. So I think we really need to focus on it that way.
Thank you. And I can announce that it looks like there's dessert being served in the back. Some of you have already noticed that. Get that going. You touched on this a little bit, Gary, and someone asked. First, I'd like to say that my question was almost like Joel had 3 questions that was almost just like that. what the heck? Why isn't this obvious to everyone? And there are lots of you who have the same thought, so I think that's really good resonance there. But what you talked about was healthcare. And so ideally, how would free market capitalism work in the healthcare field?
Yeah, free market capitalism hasn't been working in the healthcare field at least since World War II. Actually, if you get on our online courses, I do a lecture on healthcare. It's called The Constitution and Current Controversies or something like that, and explain a little bit. But the main thing with healthcare, think about this. When you're taking somebody out to dinner, when do you tell them you're picking up the tab?
At the end?
I know you don't take people out to dinner, but if you did, after they've ordered, right? After they've ordered. What is the way that we spend, and the federal government spends way more on healthcare than anybody else, spend about $1 trillion on healthcare. And what do? They not only tell you they're picking up the tab, they tell the waiter they're picking up the tab. So the waiter comes out with a $300 bottle of wine, right? In fact, if you get on the website of, you've probably seen that ad for the scooter, it never tells you how much it costs. You get on their website, it doesn't tell you. It tells you that we'll get Medicare to pay for it, or we'll get Medicaid to pay for it. Okay? So what you really need to do in healthcare is make it so people say, how much does that cost? And you could do that by, what did the private sector do? Went to medical savings accounts. If you put Medicare and Medicaid into medical savings accounts where you got like $2,000 and then they bought you a high deductible policy and you get to keep the $2,000 if you don't spend it, or if you run out you got to pay for between the $2,000 and the $6,000 or whatever, people would say, hey, how much does that blood work cost here versus there? And then you get a whole different mechanism for delivering the service. And you're already starting to get that with enough of these things where you have boutique medicines where they don't, or healthcare where they don't take insurance, and you have Walgreens. Some of them have a nurse practitioner there that's going to help you, and so that's really the key. Make it look like a market system.
The next question is a little different and interesting. In a market economy, how do you solve the problem of a monopoly?
Well, that's very interesting. First of all, let's think about what monopoly is. I will guarantee you that everybody in here has a monopoly over their own singing voice. Am I concerned? No. Because I don't have to buy your album. Okay? I don't have to buy your CD. Which they're not even going to make CDs anymore, but there's these vinyls on its way back. Okay? That's good to know. So what is a monopoly? If you define the product narrowly enough, you get a monopoly. The Detroit Red Wings have a monopoly over professional hockey in the city of Detroit. But they don't have a monopoly over sports entertainment in the city of Detroit or entertainment in the city of Detroit. So the real key is, are there barriers to entry, and do you have to buy it? Most barriers to entry are government created. Because if I'm earning monopoly profit, which says I'm earning more with those resources than they could somewhere else, guess what? Somebody else is going to come in. Somebody's going to enter. Why is it that they're not entering? It's almost always because government is stopping. There's a book called "Is Government the Source of Monopoly?" and other essays that I think the Cato Institute put it out a number of years ago. You don't have to worry about monopoly unless it's something that you have to buy. Let's say it's water. And there's not an ability to enter into that market. And Hayek says that if that were to be the case, then the solution is that you have to sell it at the same price to everybody. I can't coerce you by saying you don't get to buy this product. So I'm not worried about monopoly. Again, you can create a monopoly by just narrowly defining the product, and it's barriers to entry you got to worry about. Is the government setting up a barrier to entry?
That's great. Here's a question that kind of melds economics and politics. How does hiring HB1 visa workers or even illegals help the workers in the U.S.? Is that an example of a free market capital gone awry?
Well, no. I mean, think about this. If somebody comes into this room and produces more than they consume, we got more stuff per capita. If somebody comes into this room, like, okay, we have the dessert buffet back there, If we alert people, oh, we got a dessert buffet, and they all start coming in, you know, people coming in from all over to go to the fantastic dessert buffet that we don't charge for, what's going to happen? You're going to have a problem, right? The solution to immigration, I mean, you have some worry about defense issues, okay? And some screening, making sure that, which is difficult to do, but whatever. But nonetheless, the real issue on immigration is to, and Milton Friedman pointed this out 60 years ago, don't have a buffet in the backyard, okay? Don't let people come in, and if they want to come in and work, that's great. I want them to come in and work and pay Social Security taxes so that I can get my Social Security 20 years from now.
That's right. Is there a market capitalism solution for pollution?
In fact, this is a very interesting question. I teach about it in both my class on public choice and on public finance. It's what's called externalities. There is a problem, and it all comes down to private property rights. That is, do I have the right to drive my car and put unleaded gas in my car, which I used to in 1975 in my Dodge truck, or do you have the right to clean air? That's a question. You need to define those property rights. And a guy named Ronald Coase won the Nobel Prize in Economics for pointing out that if transactions costs are low, what will happen is people will bargain over it. If you have a situation, like let's say I'm polluting your lake with my factory pollution, and it saves me $100 to do that, and it costs you $80 in killed fish, and I have the right to pollute, what will happen? The right is more valuable to me, right? Because it's worth $100 to me and only $80 to you. I'll keep it. But if you get the right, what will happen? I'll buy the right from you. If there's not transactions costs, I'll buy the right to you. So the property rights will go to where they should be. Now, if transactions costs are high, such as with driving down the road, you know, it was hard for me to pay everybody a penny so that I could drive by and put lead into the atmosphere, you know, then the government has a role to protect property rights. Now they may get it, you know, get it wrong, but there is a role for government in pollution, or where you're imposing a cost on me that is not in the price system. You're not figuring that out when you're deciding how much to produce of something. So, but the real first track is to try to reduce the transactions cost. Now, part of it we just do socially. Do you have the right to mow your lawn on Saturday morning with your power mower at 6 o'clock in the morning, or does the neighbor have the right to quiet? 6 o'clock in the morning, we're all going to say, quiet, right? 8 o'clock, probably quiet. 9 o'clock, now you're starting to get there, right? 10 o'clock, you're being a jerk if you're telling me I can't mow my lawn at 10 o'clock, all right? So a lot of these externality problems get solved socially. If you're going to have a party and make all sorts of noise, what do? Invite the neighbor, okay?
Maybe along those lines, how about a cure, or can you address homelessness with free market capitalism?
Well, why are people homeless? Okay, they're homeless because they're not producing. Now, some of people are homeless because of addictions to opioids or whatever. But really what's going on is they're not able to produce enough to be able to purchase a place to live. Now, if you ever remember the story about the poor little match girl, okay? Poor little match girl, spoiler alert, she's going to freeze to death. Why is that? She's selling matches. We don't even know how much a box of matches costs. So what does that mean? It means if you're going to be in a market capitalist system, it is your responsibility to help the poor. If people are going to still be poor, not as many, certainly not nearly as many people who are poor, because the system is going to increase your productivity. We're going to invest in your human capital, etc. But nonetheless, if people are poor, we got to take care of them. And we don't want to hear that. If you Google Gary Wolfram Scrooge, You'll actually get an article that I wrote in Christmas. And what it was about is, in the book Christmas Carol, what happens? Scrooge's nephews come in and they want to have him give them some money. And his response is, not bah humbug, his response is, are there no poorhouses? And then he goes on for 2 paragraphs basically saying, you taxed me and gave this money to the government to take care of the poor. I'm not taking care of the poor. In fact, Herbert Spencer, who was writing about the same time as Bastiat, said the problem with the poor laws, writing in 1848, the problem with the poor laws in Great Britain, which was their social welfare system, is not that the poor will take advantage of it, but the rich will think they don't have to take care of the poor. If you're going to live in a system of market capitalism, individual liberty, you got to say, yeah, I got to help them. I've got to donate to charity. I've got, if I see a homeless person, I've got to help them and, donate to the local homeless shelter, have my church help them. But it was interesting when John Engler was governor and I was his deputy state treasurer. He had just eliminated a law in Michigan that gave money from the state to single males who weren't married. And the reporter for The Economist said to the governor, and I was sitting right there, and the reporter says to the governor, what are you going to do when the first poor person freezes to death in Michigan? And he turns to the guy and he says, I'm going to ask, where is their family? And I thought, great answer, Governor. Yeah, we need, the family should be taking care of each other. Look what, all these government systems break down the family. We've known that for decades. And so really, we have to take on that responsibility ourselves to help those people who are not capable of producing enough to take care of themselves.
Somebody in our audience is worried how you survived UC Berkeley. As a conservative, obviously.
Well, as the Grateful Dead said, what a long, strange trip it's been. In fact, this is a Jerry Garcia tie.
I hope you. That's good. The next question is, one of the worst things of the poor in the Bay Area, you may recall, I don't know if this was big when you were here, was rent control and zoning regulations. We might be able to convince the poor of the free market values, but how do we frame the argument for the specific situation and tailor it to ensure the lefties, as they say, or people in government in California, that they're about their property values, inflating their property values with rent control?
Well, sure. Rent control is like any time that the government sets the price either above equilibrium, such as in a minimum wage, it's going to, if it does that, you're going to get less people hired. If it sets a price that's lower than equilibrium, you're going to get less stuff produced. So if I set a price on rent control, what's going to happen? People are going to convert their rental apartments into condominiums. That's what's going to happen. I'm going to make less rental housing. Now, what happens for me if I already live in the Bay Area? I want that to happen. I don't want any more people being able to build in the Bay Area, right? I want to restrict entry. And so we all have that incentive to do that. We all have an incentive to want to restrict entry if we already own a house or we already own anything. But you have to realize that when you do that, you're going to change who can live there, and you're going to and the market. If you didn't have the government in there, the market would take care of it. The market would start producing rental housing, and it would start making it so that you have to use this property. You wouldn't make it so you have to use this property this way. You could say, if I want to make rental housing, I can make rental housing. So setting the limit too low is just going to change people's behavior, and who's going to lose? The poor are going to lose. We know that. So that's not market capitalism. Rent control is not market capitalism. That is rule of man. That is someone telling us, here, you can't charge more than this for this product. Those same people, again, those same people are, what are they really doing? They're really saying, I want to make it so that my housing prices are high because I want to restrict entry into the system. And they gain from that. So that is, you know, even if you win the battle of ideas, people still have an incentive to restrict entry into whatever they are. I mean, if you're a plumber, what do you want? You want licensing for plumbers, okay? So that I think that's a difficult one, but I think if we focus on let's help the poor and demonstrate that the poor lose under rent control, that not everybody's going to lose their place, and that's just a matter of seeing and observing. Some people are going to get their house, are going to be able to rent cheaper than they otherwise would because the market price would rise. And you see those people. Who you don't see is the person that's living in the homeless shelter because they can't afford the rents that are there. So it's a matter of getting people observing, yes, some people will get to rent their house at cheaper prices, but lots of people are not going to get to be able to rent a house at all.
Yeah, great answer. We'll make this our last one. I know the evening's getting a little long. What is your opinion or give your thoughts of President Trump's recent $4 trillion budget proposal?
Well, first of all, we have time for one more question.
Yeah.
We have time for actually 5 more questions, but only one more answer. That's the problem.
Yes.
Well, I mean, part of the budget, the president's budget proposal is something that just says, here's what I'd like to do. In the Constitution, the president doesn't appropriate funds. The Congress appropriates funds. So what you really need to be looking at is what does the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee or chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, what are these folks looking at in terms of the budget proposal? I haven't had a chance to look at it. I do think we need to spend more money on infrastructure. That could be a role for government. National defense is a role for government. Now, part of the problem is if you have the role for government being national defense, what is to make it so that they make efficient use of the money that you're giving them? You don't have, there was just a recent audit of the Department of Defense and they couldn't account for millions of dollars. So you have to have that oversight. But realistically, in fact, I just had a piece that ran in, I forget what, some national thing. But it was about the fact that the only way you can deal with the debt problem, the only way you can deal with the deficit problem is to deal with entitlements. That's the only way. If you take non-defense discretionary spending, that is the spending that comes up in the 12 appropriations bills, non-defense discretionary spending is 15% of the total budget. You could take non-defense discretionary spending and almost wipe it out and you would still run a deficit. The only way to deal with deficits is the fact that you're spending $1 trillion on Medicare and Medicaid. And Social Security, you're spending $800 billion a year on Social Security. You have to deal with these entitlement programs if you're going to have anything at all to deal with long-term deficits and long-term debt. And that's going to be very hard to do because it is the third rail of politics. Now, I think the way that you do it is, again, Medicare, Medicaid, you move that to basically the equivalent of health savings accounts and extend the retirement age. When 1935, when we started Social Security, the life expectancy was 63. And we know now it's 80. So what should we do? When I was actually Congressman Smith's chief of staff, we had a bill that would have allowed people to take a portion of their Social Security and invest it themselves, because at that point there was still more money coming into Social Security than going out the door. That's not in existence anymore. There's more money going out the door than coming in. So I think what you need to do in Social Security is to say, okay, if you're 50 and younger, then we're going to start increasing the retirement age, young enough that you can plan for that. You can't do something to people that, again, rule of law, people that have counted on Social Security and done their behavior over the last 30 years based on this. You can't really flip that around. But the only way to really deal with, and the problem with the budget is only a very small, the actual budget part of it, the actual appropriations part of it is very small relative to all the spending that's going down. So it's really, I don't worry too much about the budget in the 12 appropriations bills. I really worry about that we've got these entitlement programs that have trillions of dollars in unfunded liabilities, and we have to deal with that.
What a cheery note to end on. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Gary Wolfram. See you next month for Ann Coulter.